at that point in my life, when she was so little and when I was breastfeeding constantly and really forced into stillness much more than I wanted to be, I found this yoga teacher training to be so useful to me because I would find myself propped up into awkward positions breastfeeding her and just getting stuck there for hours trying to scroll through my phone, trying to distract myself, trying to read a book or trying to do some work on my computer screen, but always just ending up getting really anxious while I was breastfeeding her. But what I realized with this yoga teacher training was that I could just be still while I was holding her. And if I was well propped up, well positioned in a way that was supporting the natural curves of my spine and supporting my body and just allowing me to fully soften, then I could be present with her, present with the experience, and just breastfeeding her without having to do anything else. And that was a very powerful lesson to me. Hi everyone. My name is Lacey. Welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. This is a podcast that's all about yoga, birth, and raising kind humans. So today we're going to be talking in the yoga realm about one topic that I really enjoy a lot. It's designing your yoga practice to help you sleep better at night. So in this podcast, we're going to be focusing on two specific practices. We're going to be focusing on Yoga Nidra, which is the yoga of sleep, and on restorative yoga. So I'm going to start with restorative yoga since it's a practice that I started practicing before I even knew about Yoga Nidra. And then we'll get into Yoga Nidra and we'll talk about the two different practices with the aim of helping you to relax the entire body so that you can sleep deeper at night. So restorative yoga is a practice that I never gravitated toward initially. When I first learned about the practice, I heard a yoga teacher in my yoga teacher training call it glorified napping, and it just was something that was so unappealing to me. I used to be into yoga for all of the crazy things about yoga, all the handstands, the arm balances, the deep postures, the splits, the things that would physically split you open to really make you feel something inside. So anytime that Shavasana came or anytime we were in a deep relaxation pose, I would hate it so much, and I would be one of those people who would open my eyes and would stare at the ceiling and would fidget and would sometimes just leave the room because I just did not know how to rest at all. My whole life up until the point that I started practicing yoga was constant movement, was constant trying to achieve things, trying to do things, because that's what I had been taught was the way to live. I pushed myself so hard to try to get into med school before I decided I wanted to go down a different path, to be a competitive runner until I really burnt out hard and realized I just could not run anymore. So I was just so used to pushing my body to an extreme that comparatively doing these quote hard yoga poses or advanced ones were just kind of something that was interesting to me. So my relationship with yoga was one that I think it was always a healthy one for the most part, because I never felt the same pressure that I did with academics and with competitive running. It was kind of just something that was always fun for me, that was like, oh wow, that's really cool that this person on Instagram can do this really big heart opener and can be super bendy. I wonder what could happen if I could move my body that way. I wonder if I can. So it was never an unhealthy relationship like I felt like my connection with running became. Like there was all this pressure to hit a certain time, and like my worth was just tied to the numbers on the clock. With yoga, it was always something that I was able to see beyond the physical aspect to some extent, maybe not before I had practiced it, but even within the first yoga practice, when my very first yoga teacher used to tell me to surrender my heart and to give into the postures and to completely let go, I always knew there was something deeper there than just the physical aspect. So I think from the beginning I had a relatively healthy relationship with yoga, but me as a person, my body living with so much pressure and tension and anxiety, I found it impossible to rest. So I never wanted to take restorative yoga. I would take it occasionally just to kind of figure out what it was, because I didn't really know at first. And then once I learned, I avoided those classes, or I would take them after doing a really sweaty vinyasa practice, because I found that it was easier to rest after that. So it was something that I never wanted to do myself. But when I became a teacher, I found that strangely, I was much better at teaching restorative yoga, or at least kind of the flow and restore format, than faster paced vinyasa classes. A big part of that had to do with my voice. I was a cheerleader in high school, but I never had a cheerleader voice. I've always been soft-spoken, and people have always been saying that they can't hear me speak my whole life, even though I'm speaking as loud as I can. So teaching vinyasa is usually okay, definitely okay if I have a mic, but teaching something like bar, which I did for a while, was really hard for me because I could not raise my voice over an entire classroom of people. When I taught restorative yoga, because I was just subbing everything at one point, I realized that very soon into the first class that I started teaching, that this kind of felt like something that was meant for me to do, because people could hear me and because people were paying attention to every single word I said. The way I speak, I speed it up a little bit on this podcast, but the way I typically speak in real life is a little bit slow and deliberate usually. And I think I choose my words with a lot of intention. So that doesn't go quite as well with the faster paced yoga classes, but with something like restorative yoga, it sits really well, and it's usually just the medicine that students need. But I found myself being able to teach those classes really effectively, especially in more of the flow and restore format, where students would kind of move around a little, shake out their wiggles, and then go into a longer restorative and sometimes yin practice. So it was something that I was really good at teaching, but still something that I didn't enjoy practicing in my day-to-day life when I was early on as a teacher. I think that shifted when I became a mother. So I signed up for my first yoga nidra training at the same time, more or less, that I signed up for my first restorative yoga teacher training. So I had been teaching restorative yoga before that, but only in places where it didn't require a certification, because I kind of felt confident enough, having practiced it enough times, to kind of know what to do. And at studios, there usually weren't enough restorative yoga teachers to need teachers to be certified in that. So I was able to teach it without technically being certified. I wish I had done the certification before ever teaching it, because I was much more minimalist on props compared to what I know now. But I signed up for my first restorative yoga teacher training around the same time that I did my yoga nidra teacher training. So restorative yoga teacher training I did just after having my first baby. It was one of my first yoga experiences really after having a baby. And I was only able to do it because this was still early on into the pandemic, where everything went online. I was working toward my 500 hour with Laughing Lotus, which used to be based in New York City, but then went all virtual during the pandemic. So I was able to sign up for this, I believe, 20-hour training through an online format, and I was able to be with my baby while I was taking these classes. So I did this, I think 2-weekend or 4-day or however long it was training when she was pretty young. I think she was probably like 2, maybe 3 months old at that point. So she was at the point where she was really just napping all the time. So it was really easy to hold her while I was watching the computer screen, and to even hold her for a lot of the restorative yoga practices, which ended up happening. At that point in my life, when she was so little and when I was breastfeeding constantly and really forced into stillness much more than I wanted to be, I found this yoga teacher training to be so useful to me, because I would find myself propped up into awkward positions breastfeeding her and just getting stuck there for hours, trying to scroll through my phone, trying to distract myself, trying to read a book or trying to do some work on my computer screen, but always just ending up getting really anxious while I was breastfeeding her. But what I realized with this yoga teacher training was that I could just be still while I was holding her. And if I was well propped up, well positioned, in a way that was supporting the natural curves of my spine and supporting my body and just allowing me to fully soften, then I could be present with her, present with the experience, and just breastfeeding her without having to do anything else. And that was a very powerful lesson to me. And that was one that was taught to me indirectly, because the training focused nothing at all on breastfeeding. It wasn't a breastfeeding training, it was a restorative yoga training. I just happened to be there with my tiny baby. So after that, I write about it in my blogs pretty often, how I just lie over a bolster breastfeeding Ezio, my second baby. And it really has made a huge difference. I'm not always lying over a bolster breastfeeding, but I think from restorative yoga, it's just kind of taught me that it's okay to be still, and it's okay to take time to position myself so that my body is supported with pillows, with blankets, with all of those things, so that both of us can be comfortable, and so that I can be there and not necessarily having to do anything. So it was a really, really powerful gift for me to receive. Yoga Nidra was a training that I did a little bit before the restorative training. I also did it virtually. It was one of the first virtual trainings I did during the pandemic, and this was when I was very, very pregnant. It was very close to giving birth to Snoopy. I think I was maybe around 35, 36 weeks, maybe 37, not quite 40 yet. So I wasn't at the end of the pregnancy. It was early enough to still sign up for it and be fairly confident that I was going to be able to complete all of the days of the training. But I signed up for the training, and it was virtual, as I said, and every single one of the days I would fall asleep during the training, completely unintentionally. So Yoga Nidra is called the yoga of sleep for a reason. It's something that I hadn't really practiced before. I had practiced it in shortened versions. I had done body scans before. I had done kind of shortened rotations of consciousness, and of course breath work and different types of meditation. But I had never done a full-on Yoga Nidra practice until signing up for this training. And I wouldn't have signed up for it if it hadn't been part of my 500 hours that I was completing anyways. So it was just so fortunate that I was able to sign up for it, and that I did sign up for it, because it really, really helped with my labor, and it really, really helped me to fall asleep at night when Snoopy was really little. And when Ezio was really little, I used it with both of my labors and with both of my newborn experiences. But Yoga Nidra, so it's the yoga of sleep. You are not supposed to fall asleep in it. That can end up happening, as it did in my case when I was super pregnant, but that's not necessarily the goal. So the goal is to stay alert and awake, but to allow the body to relax enough to be in, I believe they call it a hypnagogic state, something like that. I don't know all of the science behind it, but basically you're getting into an altered state of consciousness. It's the state right before falling asleep. So it's almost a dreamlike state, but you're still awake. And that's supposed to be the state where creativity can happen, where you can suddenly have this spontaneous idea that can provide creative inspiration, It's also the state where your subconscious is really in a pretty malleable state. It's said to be a state where a lot of healing can occur. I've heard it said that an hour of yoga nidra is worth 4 hours of deep sleep. I don't know if there's any science to back that up at all, but I will say from my experience, you are resting very deeply if you do it correctly. But it can also be hard to get into that level of rest when you're doing a yoga nidra practice, especially I find if you're in a more group setting. I find it much easier to do yoga nidra on my own because I think my body is just so relaxed at home and so much more able to soften than I am in a group setting that I'm able to get into that state a lot quicker. But yoga nidra, it is a meditation technique. So it follows a set series of things that you're supposed to do with your mind. It's usually guided by a person or by a recording, but I've done it enough that I know how to do it in my own mind. And that's how I was able to use it both in labor and during my postpartum period with both babies. In labor, I've talked about this before on this podcast, but I really heavily relied on it with Snowpe's labor, which was just so long, 29 hours. And I used it a lot in early labor when I knew I was going to need my strength later on. So I used it to catch little breaks of sleep in between contractions. So really it is a technique where you can drop your mind into a level of pretty deep rest pretty quickly while still being somewhat alert. For whatever reason, I never struggled with yoga nidra in the same way that I struggled with restorative yoga. I think that's because I started practicing restorative yoga much earlier when I was much more of a restless, anxious person. I think if I had practiced yoga nidra at that same point, it might have been pretty hard for me. But from the first time I practiced yoga nidra, of course, in my home, on my own, with this big, pregnant, tired belly, I was just able to get so deep into it and just loved it so much from the very beginning. And I really feel like these two practices are so complementary because in restorative yoga, you're in these longer held postures. You're usually there from anywhere from 5 to even 15 minutes, completely supported by props, allowing the body to fully soften and doing nothing in the mind necessarily, but you can, in a restorative yoga sequence, be practicing yoga nidra in your mind. So you could do a few restorative yoga postures and then transition into a yoga nidra practice, either with a guided meditation or just doing it in your own mind. And that can really help to set you up for sleep. I love the idea so much of practicing both of those things, yoga nidra and restorative yoga, before going to sleep. I don't do restorative yoga every night before sleep. I do tend to do it when I'm traveling because I don't always want to practice yoga on a dirty hotel floor, but I will very happily prop myself up over pillows and lie there and do heart openers. And I find that restorative yoga is very flexible in that way. You can very easily practice restorative yoga over a few pillows on a bed, and you don't need many more props than that. Pillows, blankets can be so flexible. Once you've done enough restorative yoga, you can know how to roll a blanket up in so many different ways so that it can support your body in so many different ways. So a blanket roll can support the undersides of your ankles, it can support the back of your neck, can elevate the chest. A little blanket roll can be used over your eyes, over the wrists, under the entire arms. The possibilities are just infinite, really. There's so many ways to support the body, and I feel like every time I do a deep dive into restorative yoga training, there's so much that I can still learn about using props to support the body. And that's another reason why restorative yoga is so great for sleep, because you learn to support your body in positions that you could potentially fall asleep in, and that can be translated to setting up for sleep at night. So you learn how to support the spine in positions of rest. You learn how to do side lying shavasana. You learn how to do shavasana lying on your back. You learn how to do prone positions on your belly. So there are just so many ways, really, there are so many ways to rest that I never knew at the beginning of practicing restorative yoga. And I find in doing restorative yoga that it is such a practice, and it's a talent to be able to rest, especially in this fast-paced modern world that we live in, where everyone is under so much pressure. I realized pretty quickly into teaching yoga, actually, and just watching people in Boston, which was such a fast-paced city, that I was not alone in struggling to rest at all. There's so many people who struggle to stay in Shavasana. I would say at the beginning of every yoga class, if you ever need to come out of any yoga posture, you can always transition into child's pose. And then I would be surprised when I would have students who couldn't stay in Shavasana and would transition into child's pose and then just, be restless there. Surprised and not surprised, because I struggled with it so much on my own. But practicing restorative yoga in a safe, contained environment, like you may have at home, like you may have in wherever you sleep, setting up these shapes, doing them for a few minutes each night before going to bed, can absolutely help to practice that state of rest and to ease into a deeper sleep. I know it helps me so much when I'm traveling somewhere and I'm able to just lie over a bolster for a little bit and then go to bed. Yoga Nidra, I would say I do this practice pretty consistently before falling asleep at night, even now. It was one that I leaned on much more heavily in the early postpartum days for both babies, because sleep can be so interrupted with newborns. And now they both sleep through the night, so I'm not up as much during the night. But if I ever have a restless night, just myself, and I'm trying to fall back asleep, I always do Yoga Nidra, because usually by the time I get to the rotation of consciousness or the counting the breath backwards, I'm usually asleep at that point. Not always, but usually. So these are two practices that, as I said, you can do in your yoga space, you can do in a studio, but you can also just do them before falling asleep at night or in the middle of the night if you wake up. And as I said, they don't require much. Yoga Nidra only requires your mind, and restorative yoga really only requires a bit of creativity, a bit of repositioning props to set them up in ways that support the body. So if you want a little bit more information about how to do restorative yoga and Yoga Nidra, I'm going to be leading a yoga workshop that is on this very topic. It's on restorative yoga for sleep. We're also going to be doing a little bit of Yoga Nidra in the practice. And if you're based in St. Louis, then you are more than welcome to come. So if I get this podcast out there before that date, it's going to be November 3rd in St. Louis at Urban Breath, and I'll put the link to sign up in the description for this podcast. If not, I teach Flow and Restore every week here in St. Louis, and I would just love to have you in class if you're here in St. Louis, so please do sign up for that. I do have some other videos going over some of the restorative yoga practices, and I think most of the videos I have are actually with my two little ones, so please excuse all of the craziness and our chaos and the background noise. But again, if you want a more relaxed space for doing restorative yoga, do come to those trainings. If those dates have already passed, as I said, please sign up for class, but I hope to see you on your mat either way, whether it's in class, at the workshop, or even just virtually. I hope you continue to practice with the yoga videos that I'm creating with my kids. I will be putting some more yoga videos out there that are not just for kids, that are also for adults as well. If you have ideas for what types of yoga you would like to see, or other topics for my podcast that you would like to see, please let me know, and I will try to make it happen. If you could, please leave a 5-star review if you're listening to this on Spotify or another podcast format. If you're on YouTube, please do like the podcast, like the episode, subscribe to the channel, and please let me know what you think. I cannot wait to hear from all of you. All right, I will see you next time.